My name is Lawrence Lessig, and I'm a professor of law at Harvard Law School. Well, to understand financial regulation, you have to put it in context with the change in the competitiveness of Congress. So when Newt Gingrich took over in 1995, and we had Republican control of the House, the Republicans made it very clear they were going to be waging this perpetual war to retain control of the House and keep control of the Senate so that they could control the government until they had a chance to elect a new president. And the Democrats recognized this was a huge fight they were going to have, and they were going to have to raise an enormous amount of money. And the most obvious target for that money was Wall Street, because Wall Street had a very keen sense of regulatory change that it wanted. Regulatory change in the form of deregulation to make it possible for them to experiment without regulatory oversight with these new innovations which we call derivatives. So beginning in the mid-1990s, the Clinton administration started cozying up to the Wall Street funders and signaling very clearly that they were going to be as Republican as the Republicans could be about deregulating Wall Street and allowing Wall Street to do whatever the hell it wanted. And so in a series of regulatory changes, which was capped by the abolishment of the Glass-Steagall Act, we changed banking and Wall Street in our economy from being a system where there was a very stable, secure, safe institution called banks, and not so safe, much more risky, much higher return institution called investment houses, into a financial system where those two were melded together. And banks were encouraged to gamble the way they gambled leading up to the crash, and they were so big and important to the economy that when they crashed, nobody could afford to let them fail. Now, that change in regulation was induced because of the need to raise endless amounts of money. And in some sense, you can understand why it happened, because at the same time that Congress saw this as the gold mine for campaign finance, economists were telling Congress that it was a really good idea to deregulate Wall Street. Now, of course, the economists were not telling Congress that they were being paid by Wall Street to say exactly that thing. But everybody was singing the same tune, so it's not surprising that Congress would go along with deregulation, since every time they lowered the regulatory temperature, they increased the flow of money into their campaigns. Now, the really striking thing to me, though, is after 2008. So after we have the biggest crisis since the Depression, after people independent of Wall Street, like on the left and the right, from Stiglitz to Richard Posner, one of the most important judges in the federal courts, a conservative from Chicago, linked this failure to the misregulation that had basically been purchased by this campaign funding. After the dean of deregulation, Alan Greenspan, confessed that he had been mistaken about the way in which deregulated banks would behave in this context. After all of this, the banks still had the power to blackmail Washington, both Democrats and Republicans alike, into avoiding any major reform of the system, and basically leaving the essential corruption of the system, the too big to fail nature of banking, in place. So, it's frightening enough to think that Congress did such a crazy thing in deregulating in the period up to 2008. But what's terrifying is even after this disaster, the banks have enough power to block effective reform because Congress depends so critically upon the money that the banks contribute in the context of these elections. The financial service sector was the #1 sector contributing to campaigns in 2010, and they will certainly have an enormous influence in 2012. Yeah, I mean, it feels pretty close. To people inside the system, it's almost impossible to understand what the difference is. So you read Jack Abramoff's book, and Abramoff, says it's legalized bribery. So close was it that effectively every exchange he had with a congressperson had a suggested quid pro quo in it, not explicitly enough to trigger criminal law, but everybody learns how to play the system, and you play the system in a way that makes it so people can signal what they need, and you give it to them so that they get what they need and you get what you need. And I think that's sort of the way this is in Wall Street. There was a great story in 2010, February of 2010, in the New York Times, where it was a story about Chuck Schumer speaking to a group of Wall Street people, and Schumer was basically being attacked by these Wall Street people. One Wall Street executive saying that he wanted his money back from Schumer. He wanted his contributions back from Schumer. And you kind of think, my God, nobody bent over backwards more than Chuck Schumer to give Wall Street what it wanted. And yet these Wall Street tycoons feel entitled to demand even more and feel entitled to be outraged that they didn't get even more in the context of this deregulation game. So, I think that the system evolves to a place where it's so natural to believe that you should be allowed to exert your financial influence in the system that people don't even understand what you could be worried about. And do you think? I just think it's really hard for people to think above ground level. I think they live their life. They work very hard. They're working. Congressmen work extremely hard, most of them, and they're out there raising money. They're on the telephones. They're spending their life inside the system. And to get them to step back and to think about how to change the system is really hard, because who's going to change? Who's going to make the change happen? So for most of them, like most people, they live in a bad system. They just put their heads down and they march forward. And I think at certain moments we got to figure out how to inspire enough people to liberate them so that they could feel like they could do something better than just muddle through in such a broken system. Yeah, I mean, they're not bad people in the sense that they're not focused on breaking the law. But they're certainly responsible for the system. They could change it tomorrow. You don't need a constitutional amendment to produce citizen-funded elections. That would be possible tomorrow. And so they need to do that, and they don't.